And this is our second session. Oh, we need to say it's recording. Okay, got it. This is our second session in third. Right, but that was not on controversial Teshuvot. It's our second session in the controversial Teshuvot series, our third session here in this beautiful place with this beautiful gathering of people, both in person and online. And what we're going to do today is discuss perhaps two of the hottest topics, which certainly rabbis generally try and avoid. I have a lot of friends who are rabbis in communities around the world. And the one thing, well, the two things they don't want to discuss is changes in the synagogue service and why decisions made by previous rabbis shouldn't be changed today. Oftentimes, it's like a Pandora's box. When somebody says, Rabbi, why don't we do something different in the synagogue service? I can see my friends kind of like growing gray hairs by the second. Or why is it the rabbis decided something ages ago, which doesn't seem relevant? They kind of say, we trust the rabbis. And so the topic we're going to discuss today touches on both of those points, namely changes in the synagogue service and the longevity or the timelessness of rabbinic decrees. We're going to go on a journey of looking at not just one or two, but actually I think 5 different Teshuvot, but certainly with one major voice at the center of the conversation. And that major voice being Rambam, Maimonides. And the specific conversation we're going to be having relates to Chazarat Hashatz. And for those who are slightly unfamiliar with that term, and even those who do, let's just briefly have a rundown of what it means, and then we'll see it in the sources. Chazara means to repeat. Hashatz, Shatz is the Roshei Tevot of Shliach Tzibur, and therefore it's the repetition of the prayer leader. We know that with Shachrit, Musaf, and Mincha, in a traditional prayer service, people pray the Amidah quietly, and then the Chazan repeats it, beginning with the Kedusha, right? So we have the silent Amidah, and then we have the repetition of the Amidah, which is known in rabbinic literature as Chazarat Hashatz. And what we're going to discuss today is whether there's any value, need in Chazarat Hashatz, at least in some communities. And in so doing, we're going to explore a number of rulings of the Rambam, the great Rambam, who lived between 1135 and 1204, the author of the Mishneh Torah, the Moreh Nevuchim, is Perush on the Mishnayot, and like we said last week in relation to Rashi, also the author of many Teshuvot, many responsa, decisions of questions people asked him, and the answers he gave. So with that in mind, I'm going to hold up my handout for those online. I believe you had a link from which you can download it, or you should be able to now. And we're going to go through these makorot, explaining one by one. Obviously, if there are any questions, let me know. But with a question not just about what we're discussing here, but also the precedents that can be drawn from this conversation. To what extent can the synagogue service be changed? And if rabbinic decrees seem to not apply to any given community or situation, can they be put to the side, and can we operate in a different way altogether? So those are pretty major questions. Let's begin with a quotation from Masechet Rosh Hashanah, which we're going to be getting to in a few weeks' time, since Daf Yomi is currently studying Rosh Hashanah. In Masechet Rosh Hashanah, we're told, Lama shliach tzibur yored lifnei teva, which literally means, why does a prayer leader descend before the teva, right? I wouldn't say the altar, but the prayer stand would probably be a good translation. Interesting, I say the word descend because in all the synagogues, the shliach tzibur used to pray from a lower place to fulfill the dictum of, from the depths do I call out. Nowadays, we think that the shliach tzibur is on the bima, but there are many shuls where the shliach tzibur was slightly lower down than the rest of the community. And so the question is asked in the Gemara, Lama shliach tzibur yored lifnei teva? Why does a prayer leader descend before the prayer platform? And there's specifically the question is being discussed relating to the Amidah. Really, what is a shliach tzibur doing when they say some of the prayers that we seemingly already know? Amrullah, they said to him, Kadei lotzi et she'eno baki. In order to help fulfill the mitzvah of somebody who is non-expert. Baki means an expert or familiar. And so the shliach tzibur is there to do the job of somebody who can't do it themselves. To take a simple example, if I don't know Birkat HaMazon, but I want to fulfill the mitzvah of Birkat HaMazon and somebody else does know Birkat HaMazon, they can recite it. And at the end of every blessing, I can say Amen. And there's a principle of Shomea Ka'oneh. I hear their blessing and I respond to their blessing. It's as if I've said their blessing. That applies in many areas we know with Kiddush, with different brachot throughout the Jewish year. And so, says source one, why do we have a shliach tzibur who recite prayers that seemingly we already know? It's to help those who don't already know it, right? To be their mouthpiece so that through hearing them, it's as if those people who are ill-equipped to say those longer prayers can in some measure fulfill their mitzvah. Now, this is itself very, very important. This is going to be the axis on which our whole conversation pivots. What does it mean to be the voice of somebody who is a non-expert? And what happens, of course, in a community of experts, right? That's going to be the $64,000 question. What happens in a community, maybe like this or anywhere else, where people know how to pray? Do we need to have a shliach tzibur reciting certain prayers, or specifically in the case that I was describing, repeating the Amidah? Well, how does Rambam in his Code of Jewish Law, in his Mishneh Torah, otherwise known as Yad Chazakah, present this system, this arrangement? He says, Shliach tzibur motzi et harabim yodei chovata. The prayer leader fulfills the masses of their duty. Meaning if there are masses, more than one person, or even one person themselves, who don't know how to recite the prayers, then the shliach tzibur is their agent in many ways to say the prayers for them. Ketzad, how does that work? V'shashu mitpalel, when he prays, v'hem shom'im v'onin amen, as I mentioned before, and they hear and they respond amen. Achar kol bracha v'bracha, after each individual blessing, halehen k'mitpalelim. It is like they are praying. B'med dvarim amurim, in what case are we describing? She'en yodea litpalel, with people who don't know how to pray, who are validly, authentically relying on this prayer leader to do their job. But somebody who does know how to pray and just is lazy, it's like they're sitting in a synagogue and reading the newspaper and simply responding amen because it's far too tiresome to say all those words, then that arrangement doesn't work. The shliach tzibur, their function in terms of the repetition of the midah, at least what we're going to be focusing on, although this goes broader than that, they do that job for those who can't, not for those who can. So far, so good. Any questions about those basic things that we are somewhat familiar with, but it's worthwhile noting? By the Zoom people, did you hear that question, by the way? I see head shaking, so I'll repeat the question. The question is, nevertheless, surely in the repetition of the Amidah, there are some unique texts which don't feature in the private Amidah, such as the Kedusha, or such as, for example, that second Modim, they call it Modim de Rabbanan, which is true. We'll get back to those a little bit later on. Overall, would it be possible to somehow fuse them into one rendition? There are examples of that. But notwithstanding this, what we know or what we see from the Gemara and from the Rambam is the general endeavor of the Shliach Tzibur in the synagogue, right, overall, and as we're going to dig deep, specifically in the case of Chazarat Hashat, the repetition of the Amidah, is to help those who don't know fulfill their duty. We throw in some extra things, which if we didn't have that arrangement, we could do it in a different way. You may have been to places, perhaps in schools or when people are in a rush, where they do what is sometimes known as Heicha Kedusha or Heicha Kedusha, where they say the first couple of blessings out loud of the Amidah, then they say the Kedusha, and then they go quiet, right? There are some places who may do that and then come back out loud with the Modim towards the end. Meaning, just because we're less familiar with it, there could be a way of avoiding the full repetition, such that the Shliach Tzibur isn't having to say all of that all over again. If, for example, a community is made up of men and women who are considered to be baki, expert, familiar with the text, and therefore not reliant on the Shliach Tzibur to do that job. In fact, you would even argue perhaps that there's no need for Shliach Tzibur. But putting that aside, even if there is one, they certainly wouldn't need to repeat the whole text. Don't forget, the regular daily Amidah is 19 blessings. I mean, that's 4 or 5 minutes not sitting in traffic, when you're on the way to work. You're listening to that repetition. So what's the justification for that? The answer is, for those who don't know, the question we're now going to get to is, what do we do in a community where everybody knows? Right? What do you do in a situation where the rule, the principle, the precedent, the purpose of the repetition no longer applies? And though this question has since been addressed by a number of people, we're going to begin with a responser of the Rambam, of Maimonides. We just quoted him before, who explained the function of the Shliach Tzibur, but now he's going to respond to a particular question that's asked of him.
Can I ask a question? Can you hear me?
That's why we have this system.
My question is the community may be of people who everyone knows, but maybe someone will join the community. And I'm particularly aware of this. I just came back from a trip to California of a very unique Chabad community in a town no one has ever heard of. And, most of the people there don't know. But you could be in a place where people know and someone is newly religious, becoming religious, a relative of someone stopping by. I think it's something that we need to be open to, that there's always going to be someone who may join us in our community who doesn't know as much as the rest of the people in the community.
100%. And we're going to see that argument alluded to and presented by the Rambam in this first Teshuvot. So just to repeat the question again, what happens when you have a system which seems to be based on a lack of knowledge, where seemingly everybody knows? Seemingly saying, well, there's sometimes people who come, panim chadashot, new faces to the community. Not a strong argument. But naniach, you're in some kind of middle of nowhere place, right? You're a yeshiva who goes away to some kind of far-flung place. Nobody's coming to you. And you know for sure that whoever was at the beginning of davening is going to be the same people at the end. So how about then? Should in such a situation there still be the need of the repetition of the Amidah? And of course, this touches on this very delicate question. What do we do with rabbinic decrees and enactments when they seem to not apply anymore? This is just one, but there are plenty many. We have that classic question of the second day yont that comes up all the time. Other people talk about kitniyot, etc. But there are plenty others too. What do we do with rabbinic decrees when they seem to not be relevant anymore? So the Rambam is asked this question, and just before I read it, it's important to draw a distinction between sources 2 and 3, just in terms of what they are. There are two types, or let's say two more, but two major types of Jewish legal literature. One is not what is known as codes, right? Rules, laws written by Torah scholars about what people should do, but generally written through some kind of academic analysis, although based certainly on the reality which that scholar and their earlier teachers may have encountered. That is the Mishneh Torah, that is the Shulchan Aruch, that is the Torah. We have lots of halachic codes. What's different with responsa to codes is responsa comes from real life questions. It begins in the shetach, in the field, where there is a person or some people asking a question. It's not a theoretical consideration or an idealized expression of how things should be. Here you have a real life question from real life people facing real life problems. It's one of the reasons I adore Sheilot Teshuvot. That's why we're doing this course on controversial Teshuvot, because Sheilot and Teshuvot are such a rich window in understanding sometimes the stresses in Jewish living, or the challenge of putting the theoretical rules found in codes into practice in our real life. It doesn't always fit, like those kids' toys when you have things that don't quite fit the holes, a square into a round peg or whatever the other options could be. Sometimes that's how Jewish law seems to feel. You know the theory, but in practice it's really hard. And that's what Sheilot and Teshuvot are all about, trying to figure out how to fit and what compromises sometimes need to be made. Anyway, what is the Rambam asked? He's asked a question. Imagine somebody, rather than asking some kind of contemporary rabbi, we've got a question, who should we ask the Rambam? Yeah, he's a good address, right? So the Rambam gets this question, Yoreinu Moreinu, please guide us, our teacher. In a group of people where the majority of them are expert in tefillah, expert meaning they're familiar. The word baki really means familiar, capable, right? They know the words. If now, the case being presented is where the majority of people know the tefillah, but not all. And the question is, does this principle of needing to repeat the Amidah apply when the Rav, the majority, no? In general, Jewish law speaks about majority wins. So here, 80%, 9%, maybe 99%, they know the prayers. Okay, so Shlomi or Shlomit, right? They don't, but do we really need to wait the extra time for the repetition of Amidah for one person? Or to take it to the next level, all of them know we really need to do this. So the question obviously touches on all these delicate issues of application of rabbinic decrees when they seem to apply less or not at all, and obviously changes in the synagogue service, which we're very, very touchy about, but he's discussing it 800 years ago. Can you change the synagogue service when it doesn't seem to apply to those present? What do you think?
I was just thinking that it's like a helpful format today, because then we've got communication over by heart. That was what that came in. It wasn't printing books.
Right.
So not everyone had a siddur.
Right.
It's probably how many people had a siddur. You don't have to repeat, but she's going to repeat that. Oh, okay.
Okay, so we'll repeat, or we'll move the microphone, maybe, whatever. I don't know. Whatever you're comfortable. So the question is, or the observation is, it seems to be a kal v'chomer nowadays where we have sidurim compared to then when they didn't. Interesting, the Rambam himself didn't just write the rule of prayer and wrote response about prayer, but he actually wrote a prayer book, which is at the end of the Mishneh Torah, because at that point there were variations of what to say and how things should be. So thus, nowadays, what would you argue?
Everyone can read, even if you don't know it by heart. Most people can read it.
Right. So nowadays, if most people can read it,
Right.
the argument very much should be for the cancellation of Chazarat Hashatz. Right?
Well, I mean, it's true. Most people can read, but for instance, it's a long time ago now. When I was a little girl, or even an older girl, and I went to shul in South Africa, the vast majority of the ladies couldn't read Hebrew.
100%.
Or when we lived in Petah Tikva like 20 years ago, we occasionally went to an Iraqi shul, and there the women were illiterate. I mean, there are still people out there.
I'm well aware.
Okay, so you don't really count women. At this stage, they didn't. I'm talking about that. At this stage, they didn't go to. At this stage, they didn't go to shul, perhaps. But today, there are lots of women or lots of people who still can't read Hebrew. It's not a question of just being able to read. It's a question of being acquainted with the Siddur.
So we have two issues here. Number one is, what do we do in a reality that we seemingly understand where the majority or everybody knows of prayers? And number two is, do we need to know whether everybody can, do we need to kind of have somebody at the entrance of the shul saying, can you? Imagine they say, everyone's in, lock the door. They all know it. We have 5 minutes, we can finish earlier. They all know it. I mean, that could be done. In a weekday, you get some kind of Google form, you have to fill it in. And if you know what to say, then all the better. So what does the Rambam answer? He answers in this tshuva, and by the way, we're going to see that people like the Rambam wrote many teshuvot, and unlike nowadays in the modern press, where a responsive author often collates their own response and publishes them, or their child oftentimes. He wrote answers, and often later on they were collected, and that means we actually have a number of different collections of the response of the Rambam. So this one is known oftentimes as Pera Hador. Just it's a title given to that collection of the Rambam's response. What does he say in Rambam She'elah Teshuvot Perador? Given basically the rabbis established this principle that a shliach tzibur should go and fulfill the duty of somebody who is unfamiliar with the prayers. He then goes back to the Gemara. I won't bore you into it because Rabbi Gamliel has a slightly different view. He says, even according to all other opinions, this would seem to be a valid thing to do. אפילו אין בזאת חבורה מי שלא יצא, וכמו שתקנו בקידוש בית הכנסת, ואם היו בפני האורחים וחייבו כן בכל בתי כנסיות, אפילו אין שם אורחים. So let me explain to you this, because what the Rambam does is he compares Chazarat Hashat to a different institution, which strangely many of us may not see today, but most of us probably saw as we grew up. When I grew up on a Friday night, at the end of the prayers, there was a kiddush recited in shul, right? The chazan would take a cup of wine and recite kiddush. Oftentimes children in the community would come and drink. And why do we do this? The truth is we do it for people who didn't have a home, who need to be motzi kiddush. At least if they came to shul, they'd hear kiddush, some of them would actually drink. There are occasions in the shul where I grew up where it wasn't children, but there would be somebody who unfortunately doesn't have a home, who would drink the wine themselves. They need that kiddush. Now, what happens if you say, where we live, everybody has a place to go? Now, interestingly, there are communities that no longer do this. That's for a different conversation. But for the Rambam, at least his general approach is, when we make a rule, because of the maybe, because maybe they could be people who can't pray, or maybe there may be people who don't have a home to go to, that rule is kept to, and we don't need to survey who's here. That rule was instituted in good faith for many different possibilities. And since it was instituted for the general population, we do it, and we don't individuate between one community and the other, one Shabbos and the other, or who's here and who's not. He says, just as with shul, with a Bet Knesset, we do this kiddush on a Friday night, even if there is no guest passing by or nobody who has any place to go to. Similarly so, he goes on to say, we should do Chazat Hashatz. Similarly so, he says, you have to do what's been instituted, whether the reason seems to apply in this given situation or not. He says, because were that not to be the case, our rabbis would require that we actually have to evaluate who is there. He actually says it. You have to figure out, ask, who knows the prayers, who doesn't know the prayers, and then decide whether the shliach tzibur is going to do the repetition or not. And that would just be crazy, basically. That would undermine the whole idea of rabbis making decrees that if every single situation you have to do some kind of survey. So Teshuvah number one of the Rambam is the rule was made by the rabbis, as was the rule of Kiddush on Friday night. And yes, noted, there could well be situations whenever you know the prayers. And yes, noted, there could well be situations where there are no passers-by for the Kiddush. But basically, when we establish these rules in good faith, we keep them whether or not. We're not expected, nor would it necessarily be wise or even pleasant to constantly try and ask these questions. Don't forget, if you're asking who doesn't know how to pray, is somebody really going to put their hand up?
Right,
so,
because of embarrassment.
Right, exactly. Because of embarrassment, they may not even say if they don't know.
So an embarrassment in public like that.
Right. So Ben Kach, Rambam Paskins, we keep things as they are, and he signs off. But Katav Moshe. By the way, if you're something like the Rambam, you don't need to have a nice fancy kind of title. It's Moshe. It just shows the humility of a person, a sign of just Moshe, right? Moshe. On his gravesite, don't forget. From Moses, our teacher in the Torah, to Moses Maimonides, there was no such person like Moses. That's Teshuvah, one of the Rambam. And you'd say, well, I've sold you short. This is called controversial Teshuvot. That doesn't sound particularly controversial. Yeah, but I told you there's lots of collections of the Teshuvot of the Rambam, and now we're going to look at a different Teshuvah of the Rambam. And this is published in this is the Teshuvot Rambam published in Yerushalayim in some year or another. I can give you more specific details. And in that collection, it's Simon Lamed Vav. Okay, so if you have a regular volume at home of Teshuvot Rambam, you probably have this one, which is source number 4, rather than this one, source number 3. But whatever the case. And here, the Rambam was asked a series of questions about prayer. They were all snowballed into one, which is why I don't have a simple Sheila Teshuvah. I could give it to you, but it will go on for pages. But he's asked a whole variety of questions about prayer and about prayer decorum and about appropriate behavior and decision-making in a synagogue service. And he then described a frustrating reality in a shul. And I want to show you where he does so and tell you what he says in response to that. He says, ideally, in every shul, we should have the silent Amidah, we should have the repetition. He begins by making clear what he feels is the right thing to do. He already codified that in source number 2. He says, however, and this is now line 4, he says, however, there's a decision I feel we have to take for reasons I'm about to explain in this particular situation. He's been presented a particular community in Egypt. Remember, Rambam was a rabbi in Egypt for most of his life. And what was happening in this community? And I'm going to read it to you, and you are going to be shocked that this would be the general way of behaving in a synagogue during the days of the Rambam, no less. What's happening in this particular community? When the Shliach Tzibor is repeating the Amidah out loud, after you've done the silent one, he's repeating out loud. Whoever since prayed, meaning whoever did say the silent Amidah, whoever was Baki. So what would you expect the people who are Baki? To be respectful, because they appreciate the power of Tefillah. Once they fulfill their duty, they'll start chatting to their friend next to them. They'll start talking about worthless things. And they'll turn their face from the east. And they'll literally spit. They'll just do disgusting things, clear their throat. And what will happen? The person who is relying on the repetition of the midah, who is not baki, and they see the expert, the from person, who is not behaving well during the repetition, Yaser Gamhu, he's going to do the same thing, right? If Mr. Cohen's behaving that way and he knows about prayer, right, then surely it must be appropriate for me to act that way. And it then becomes a mockery. He goes on to say, it creates a Hilul Hashem. The whole prayer service becomes disgraceful. The people who pray quietly then can't be bothered for their petition. It's not for them, they talk. The people who are, it is for them, they watch the people who are now talking and say, I don't know what I'm doing any which way. So they talk as well. The whole repetition of Amidah is entirely disturbed. The Rambam says, in a tragic situation like this, then we shouldn't have the repetition. Then the Shliach Tzibur should begin out loud and quiet, meaning, remember I said to you before, there's a way to fuse the two, to not have the repetition. In a frustrating, annoying, tragic case like this, where people don't show respect to Tefillah, then Nachon, I'd rather save prayer by not repeating prayer, because repeating prayer is itself an insult of prayer. This is not a psat the Rambam is thrilled to rule on. He's not saying, I'm happy with my decision, but he's being pushed to the wall in many ways. Either you maintain the repetition as everybody is talking, disturbing, disrespecting, nobody is saying amen, bracha levatala, all that kind of stuff, or you say we need to make a change, given the situation. And the Rambam, notwithstanding his ruling in number 2, which is the codified rule, this is what things should be done. And notwithstanding his ruling in number 3, where he was asked what should happen when people are baki, he says, you keep on doing repetition. In source number 4, he says, but where there are people who are disrespecting, disturbing, where nobody's paying attention to the Chazarat HaShatz, then don't do it. Now, this itself is curious. Firstly, you have a posek of the gravitas of the Rambam, with 2 rulings which are literally one opposite the other. One, he says, you stand up, a Chazarat HaShatz, not stand up physically, some people do that, right? You need to protect it, right? That it has integrity, and even if everybody knows the prayers, we do it because we respect Chazal. And the other is, people are disrespecting prayer. And with a heavy heart, I must accept the fact that this is the right rule. And he passes that way. He writes a rule, he says, in this situation, there shouldn't be. Now, just pause it for a second before we ask, what do we do with that? Just think about the far-reaching consequences of a ruling like that in terms of our contemporary discussion, which oftentimes does occur about changes in synagogue service. I told you, a lot of my friends who are rabbis, the last thing they want are people nagging about trying to change the synagogue service and saying, if things don't apply, then surely we should stop them. And they try and fight a good battle, and they speak about Masorah and tradition. And yet you've got this, the Rambam of all sorts, who seems to be saying, in some situations, perhaps with a heavy heart, but nevertheless, a green light's been given to make those changes.
He couldn't have made another. He couldn't have suggested another thing that they tell people to be quiet.
Okay, so this is an interesting question. It is,
Did they hear your question?
so I'll just repeat. The question is,
Did you hear the question? Did they hear it?
was a question heard? Oh, the question is heard. There we go. Fantastic. Thank you. To use almost medical terms, sometimes we speak about salvageable and non-salvageable patients. I think in this case, the Rambam was asking himself, is this a salvageable, non-salvageable situation? And seemingly from the situation that he was either directly familiar with or told about in great detail, he seemed to feel that this was a non-salvageable situation. I mean, he doesn't just simply say people are talking, but some people are listening. He's saying the frummers, I say that term loosely, but the ones who know the prayers, they're talking, they're chatting, they're speaking about worthless things in shul, they're spitting, they're turning their face from the east wall, right? They are really making a mockery. And those who are coming or less familiar, they're just joining in with that because they presume that's how one should behave. In such a situation, it seems that it is non-salvageable. In that particular situation, he paskins again with reluctance and with regret that Chazarat HaShatz shouldn't be repeated. So far, we have
Rav Johnny,
yeah.
I'm very uncomfortable with that whole situation. It sounds like almost like I'm picturing almost like bullying. Like they're and it doesn't seem like the behavior that would be fit for people who are, I don't know, Torah observing Jews.
I didn't say they were.
But I'm saying to make that psak is almost to encourage that those sort of methods could be, I don't know, you know what I'm saying? It's like the way that they could have went and spoke and said, this, they could have asked a shaila, saying, a direct shaila, but instead they behaved badly, and then because of that, there's a psak. It makes me very uncomfortable.
I've said that I love responsa literature, but one of the reasons I find it so fascinating is you get to see a real window into Jewish practice. If you only read codes, you think everyone behaves well. If you read responsa, you realize that's ridiculous. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, that I think more of us, if we're interested in halakha, should study responsa, because we get to see the gritty side of the application of halakha to sometimes frustrating and agitating situations. Yes, people they sometimes force the hand of a posek. They didn't tell the Rambam what to decide, but the situation in which this was playing out led the Rambam to reach this decision. Of course, he could have continued otherwise, but it is ultimately a shikul. It's an evaluation of what is more precious. Sometimes less is more. And in his case, he was saying less is more. And it may sound strange to us, but no, this applies in many, many, many areas of Jewish practice, where we make decisions based on how we think people are going to behave, which is one of the reasons why poskim need to be at least somewhat familiar with human psychology, how people behave, how they understand reactions of people, what they think they should expect of people, because all of that are factors in their halachic decision making. We're not robots. People do react in different ways to different things. And asking too much of people is oftentimes the best way to make a mockery of Jewish practice. So these are questions that people consider just even on a very, very small level. You imagine I'm a Rabbi of a shul, and to me saying all the piyutim on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is really sacred. And yet I know my community kind of want to leave by 12 or 1, whatever. So I make a choice. What do I stand up for? The lengthy prayers for those precious piyutim, or the reality that some of the community are going to leave at some point or another, whether or not the prayer service is done. You may say that's forcing the hand of the rabbi. That welcome to practical rabbinics. It happens every day. Every question is oftentimes these kind of situations where you need to understand where people are at in terms of figuring out what's the right thing to do, obviously while paying attention to what is more weighty in the evaluation of Jewish law, the prayer or the kavod or the listening or the amens, etc. Now, I should say that in a different version of the Teshuvot of the Rambam, known as the Mekitzei Nirdamim edition, there is an extra line added, where it says, Omnam im efshar sheyesh asara mehem. Though Rambam paskin this, he added a caveat, which is if there are a minion of people who mostly all of them are going to listen to the repetition, even if the rest of them are acting like crazies, then you should still keep Chazarat Hashatz, right? It's a bit like Abraham, can we find 10 people who are going to listen to the repetition of the Amidah? And if we can, then even if everybody else is talking, so be it. And actually in many, many, many communities, that's exactly what happens. The great majority are not paying attention during Chazarat Hashatz. And the Chazan or the rabbi are relying on a handful of loyal men and women who are listening, who are saying amen, and they say, well, for them, it's legitimizing what we're doing. It's not making it a complete mockery, even though we can hear the hum of chitter-chatter all across the place. Quick thought, yeah?
We actually had a rabbi in our show who, when the chatter got too loud, he would stop. He wouldn't say a word, he would stop. It took quite a few weeks for the message to get through, but he wouldn't continue. People started to realize that he wasn't going any further with the davening until they stopped chattering. Right? And then at the end, you would get the message over that without these breaks, we could actually finish earlier. Right? But it took weeks for the message to get through, but it worked.
Well, it may have worked in that community, and that's great. Sometimes, firstly, a religious leader doesn't have that authority. Sometimes a place is simply too big to stop, these big cathedral synagogues, right? You can't stop 2,000 people talking just by waving your hand. Halavai. Trust me, my rabbi friends dream of that. That's the kind of dreams that rabbis have. Anyway, and sometimes you don't have, right, a leader to be able to do that. Here in many shuls in Israel, we don't have a rabbi to make those decisions, or represent for that matter, and Nizrat Nashim. So You need to make decisions based on how things are. I pray in a shul where I'm one of the two poskim, but there's no formal rabbi of the shul. So we make decisions based on how people behave. And that's kind of an interesting situation. Anyway, so this is what the Hotzat Mekitzei Nirdamim adds in terms of the ruling of the Rambam. Now, you may well say, okay, well, the Rambam must have been just like a one-time thing in this community. Well, there's an interesting sefer which collects different chidushim, insight on the Rambam's Mishneh Torah, known as Maaseh Rakach. It's written, if you see at the bottom, I've always tried to add a little bit of biographical information by Rav Masud Hai Rakach. And that book begins with a list of insights from Rambam's son, of Avram ben Rambam, about the practices of his father. And I was looking through this and ahead of our shiur. And Rav Avram ben Rambam makes the following interesting remark. He makes reference to this second ruling of the Rambam. Remember, the Rambam was asked by one community, should we change? He says, you do not change. Another community which are acting crazy, he says, with regret, yes, you should not do the repetition of that midah. And now his son testifies, and this is, the pen of his son. He says, it's very well known that what my father, my teacher, Paskin ruled, of which all his contemporary religious leaders agree with him, meaning the Rambam Paskins this, and all the other Rabbanim of Egypt agreed with his psak. By the way, I don't know how you're going to argue with the Rambam. Like, what do you know? Imagine the Rambam Paskins something, and another Rav from a different community says, But don't forget, actually, even in the life of the Rambam, there were his detractors. But seemingly, at least in the field of practical rabbinics, where he paskined this case and ruled they shouldn't do chazarat hashatz, his contemporaries agreed with him. And he said, and he goes on and he summarized, quoting the sources we've seen so before. And he goes on to say that this continued in this community, kol yomei chayav, all the years of my father's life, v'achar p'tirato, and even after my father passed away. And he says, V'nitzulo ha'am, is the last line of this section, minichshol, my father saved them from that stumbling block of repetition of the Amidah. What we mean by that is, the repetition of the Amidah isn't a stumbling block when treated respectfully. On the contrary, it's a way for people who don't know how to pray to be able to fulfill their mitzvah. But here, by repeating where people behave so badly, they are offending prayer. They're showing a lack of kavod to tefillah. And in fact, rather than something beautiful and wonderful, it turns to being something that they've done harm to their own souls through. He says, my father, by making this ruling of not doing chazar hashatz, saved them from this stumbling block. And not one, he repeats it again, not one of his contemporaries disagreed. What we see from this remark of his son is that oftentimes decisions have to be made which are regrettable, but in fact, in terms of the analysis and the calculus of what is right for a given particular situation is right for them. There are things that certain communities decide for themselves or have decisions made for them that are entirely inapplicable elsewhere, which is one of the dangers nowadays, where people say, well, I saw this community do X, and we don't know the background of why that community does X. We don't have the history, who they spoke with, who they advised with, what triggered that particular decision. Just because you see something actually tells me nothing as to why that community got to what they did. So this given community in Egypt continued this way from the time of the Rambam's psak for maybe a century, maybe longer, but certainly became a well-known thing. And in that shul, imagine that shul that had this psak. Everyone knew that was a noisy shul, right? In that shul, they don't do the repetition because of the way people behave. I don't think it doesn't give it all 5 stars on its kind of uber rating, but it explains why they did what they did. Any quick thoughts before we go on? Okay. Now, what's interesting, when you have controversial teshuvot or unusual, unexpected teshuvot or rulings, is that others pay attention to them. As mentioned, we often go to communities and we see things and we say, aha, maybe I can borrow a little of that. Maybe we can apply that to our community. And what happens here in source 7 is just that. So we've seen the Rambam, we know what he feels in his heart of hearts, we know what he feels he has to pass in terms of this given community in Egypt. We know that he did add some kind of disclaimer if there were 10 people who were listening. We know that his son testified that this was kept to for many, many years. And then a couple of hundred years later, we have a question of the Radbaz. Just curiosity, anybody heard of the Radbaz? So Radbaz, as it happens, was a chief rabbi in Egypt for 40 years. He is one of the most prodigious halachic scholars who wrote thousands of teshuvot, 3,000 or something, in his set of Sheilot Teshuvot Radbaz. One of the reasons we're doing this course is also to introduce these names. It's strange to live in a world where we know perhaps interesting entertainer like Rabbi and Rebbetzin, so I applaud and they're great, but if we don't know the name of the Radbaz and we're interested in halacha, something went wrong on our journey. The Radbaz is a giant. The Rambam is a giant.
Only wrote the sponsor, or
He wrote other things too, but this was kind of his major. If you're somebody, we talk about Rav Moshe. Imagine you're somebody who lives 500 years ago, and there's more than 3,000 questions asked of you, of which we have the answers, which had led to precedent over the last 500 years of Jewish halachic decision making. Right? That's massive. But who I haven't mentioned, we're going to mention in future weeks, people like the Rashba, who is also a giant. Meaning what I'm trying to do is go chronologically, but even in every session, perhaps mention other authors who have dealt with particular questions similar to this. So Rabaz is asked a question. Sha'alta many yedid nafshi, my dear friend, you've asked me a question. Amaseh shaya bishnat hey reish tzaditet. I actually didn't yet do the calculation. But, he's living between 1479 and 1573. נתעוררו קהל ספרדים על קהל המוסתערב על עניין חזרת התפילה. Basically, a shul wants to do what that shul that got the head of the Rambam is doing. Yeah? So I'll say that again. A shul in Egypt says, we want to be like the noisy shul. We don't want to do Chazarat Hashatz. Most of us talk anyway. They're fans of that other shul. And they want some kind of rabbinic endorsement. And eventually the question comes to the Radbaz. Now, the shul at hand has done their homework. There wasn't Google, but they obviously were at least somewhat literate. Because as part of their argument, guess who they quote as being the person who gives a very good kosher heter, right, for avoiding, not repeating the Chazarat Hashatz, the Rambam. And in their question, and by the way, this is a abridged version, it goes on about 4 pages on this precise print of this particular question. In the question asked the Radbaz, this community says, people talk during services, and we know about the Rambam's ruling, we know about this, we know his son testified this went on. We're in the same boat. So Radbaz, come on. Surely we should stop saying Chazarat Hashatz. It's strange sometimes when people ask for a heter for something they know in the heart of hearts they shouldn't be asking for. The Rambam heavy-heartedly agreed to a certain situation, but this community is now proactively seeking it on the precedent of the Rambam. And I'll tell you what the Radbaz says, as does, was it the Rivash, who made a similar remark, which is really interesting, as we're going to see has precedent till today. He said, one of the reasons why that shul that the Rambam paskined for, to avoid them repeating Amidah, one of the reasons he allowed that was because those who knew still weren't knowledgeable. They could read the prayers, but they clearly weren't respectful. Don't forget, they were talking during Chazal Tashatz. That shows a real lack of respect to the power of tefillah. And there are a lot of people who didn't know. And the Rabbi says, you, this community is writing to me, you clearly know more about Jewish law. You clearly have respect for Jewish law. And if you have respect for Jewish law, you shouldn't be seeking to cancel Chazal Tashatz. Meaning, the very fact that you answered me with this elaborate question points to the fact that you know in your heart of hearts that this shouldn't be done. You're looking for a back door. You're looking to go home a little bit early. But if you know the Rambam paskins this, if you know this person, if you know Avram ben Rambam wrote this, you should also know that talking during tefillah is wrong. And if talking during tefillah is wrong, then why on earth are you asking for a heter based on the fact you were talking tefillah? It's actually frustrating, right? The Radbaz responds that you're asking me this because you know that this should be done. You know that this is what the sages wanted. And you know, in fact, that the Rambam wrote elsewhere that we really shouldn't be changing the prayer service. And only in a worse situation, we feel we have to do so. I don't think you're in the worst situation. I think you're just opportunists. And the answer is no. That's what the Red Bus says. So,
the community, I know this is Alexandria or Cairo, wherever it was relatively, in inverted commas, enlightened in Egypt in those days, no?
mm-hmm.
I'm just saying that I'm just trying to draw parallel to, I mean, it wasn't like the Dark Ages, or it wasn't,
Not at all.
it was a very, Egypt was an advanced country.
100%.
And the Jews also, they were involved in all kinds of things.
I'm
just asking if that's correct.
That's correct. I mean,
Was that
I'm
an
not
impact on the whole behavior of the people, I think?
I think so, and that's evident in a lot of the questions after the Red Bus, not just here. You see, questions from merchants, questions, this is a very, very major trade region where people who are also mixing with those of other cultures, other practices. They're intelligent. I mean, the right question that's asked here of the Radbaz speaks of their intelligence, but they're also opportunists, right? And he says no. Now, he remember, it's important to know, like many great Rabbanim, he was asked a question probably from a more junior rabbi who was asked a question by the community. Remember, he wrote, "My dear friend." He wasn't writing that to the person who has no interest in prayer. So he then tells, sorry?
I have a comment when you're finished.
Okay, so right at the end of his teshuvah, he kind of says, the answer is no. If that can't work, if it's going to be kind of a chaos erupting in the shul, whatever will be, will be. But his advice to the person asking them is, they should be saying two amidot, one silent, one repetition. And if we can't stop them from doing what they seemingly, by the way, have already started toying around with, but want some kind of rabbinic endorsement, right? Sheva al tasa, just leave it be, just don't get involved to avoid greater machloket. Here too, by the way, there comes a point where the Radbaz is quite clear what the shul should be doing, but he's also quite clear that sometimes people behave in inappropriate ways. And to avoid machloket, sometimes major halachic compromises are endorsed, presented, or at least allowed to pass. So quick query, because we've got a couple more sources to get through. So questions from Cindy or anybody else, by the way, online as well.
So no, I just wanted to relate a little bit to Livia's comment, and I saw you didn't relate to the nuance that was in the Radbaz's tshuva, which it was the people who were asking the question were from the Kihila HaSfaradit, and the Kihila that the Rambam was posek for was the Kihila of the Mustaravim. Now just like briefly, the Sephardim were the Jews who came from Spain, and they came before 1492, so they were still very educated and they were on a very high level. The Mustaravim were the locals who were like Arab Jews. They adapted, and they were on a lower level educationally and maybe culturally than the Spanish Jews. So we're talking about two very different types of communities. So the Spanish Jews are coming and asking a question. They said, well, this was the psak for the Mustaravim. Why don't we get that psak too? But it's interesting because they're different types of kihilot.
Correct, but we're going to be touching on that in source 8. I'm pleased you pointed that out, but it's going to have an impact on an interesting reality that may or may not surprise people. What I can tell you is the Rivash, I didn't quote him, we quoted the Radbaz, speaks of how in Aragon, they were already just doing one Amidah, meaning there were some communities in that region too who'd already adopted that. So correct in terms of distinguishing in Egypt, but nevertheless, there was already practicing communities who had gone based on the Rambam's ruling to decide that one Amidah is all that suffices. Now, why do I mention that? Because this isn't just a theoretical curiosity. Some of you may or may not know that my rabbinical training was actually in a central London synagogue. I'm from the suburbs of London, a place called Edgware, it's very nice. Anyway, but I trained in a Spanish and Portuguese community in central London known as Lauderdale Road. It's the sister community to the Bevis Marks community, you may have heard of it, the oldest active synagogue in Europe. And why is that interesting? Because when I went to college, I moved into that community. I served basically as a assistant kind of quasi rabbi as I was studying for smicha. And the Spanish and Portuguese community have many different practices. They have a choir, they wear top hats. If you want, I can show you pictures of me wearing a top hat. It's a little bit scary, but whatever. But in addition to that, when it comes to Musaf on Shabbat morning, they don't repeat it. In fact, they have an interesting series of books called Keter Shem Tov, written by a fascinating scholar called Shem Tov Gagin, who was the head of the original Montefiore Kollel, established by Moses Montefiore in Ramsgate, where he lived. I actually went to the modern day version of the Montefiore Kollel, which was re-established in London. But what does Shem Tov Gagin do? He records the practices of primarily the Spanish and Portuguese community. And here you see in source 8, and I can testify to this because I lived in this community for 3 years. Aminhag London Amsterdam, she'en omrim hamusaf b'chazara. The custom in the London Spanish Portuguese communities, that is, Bevis Marks, Lauderdale Road, and a couple of other smaller places, and in Amsterdam, and you'll probably be there as well, right, in Spanish Portuguese, sure, that they do not do the repetition of the Musaf. They simply say the first 3 brachot out loud, then it goes quietly, and they say the last 3 brachot out loud, with the exception of the first day of Pesach, and the 8th day of Sukkot, and the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where extra things are said. Then the repetition is said. He says, though, however, in Israel and in Egypt, in most communities, and in Syria and numerous other places, they do the repetition, as does all Ashkenazic communities. So when I turned up, I grew up in an Ashkenazi, I'm Sephardic by birth, but I grew up in an Ashkenazi community in the suburbs. And I came there and I was like, what are you doing? What, have you forgotten something? But I then read this book and came to realize that this decision made. Now, what do you think is the rationale given for why they don't do a repetition? Well, Shem Tov Gagin, this is the top part of the book. At the bottom, he gives the explanations. I didn't bring this to you. I'm happy to send this to you. By the way, you can access the whole series of books on HebrewBooks.org for free. And what does Shem Tov Gagin basically say? He says, we were like a community in Egypt that people talked. Meaning this isn't the shvach, this isn't a praise of their own community, it's everyone talks. So what are you going to do? So we decided that to save the Amidah, we decided not to do the repetition.
So you say through Shacharit they could fully behave themselves, so when it got to Musaf, that was too much.
I'm not making any comment on a particular community, but that was the decision taken, and that is practiced. And that's explained by Shem Tov Gagin and the rabbis and others who officiate there. For me, as I say, it was startling, but they believe not only that they have history. Why? I now go back to what Cindy was saying, because who are the Spanish and Portuguese community? They refer back to those who come from Aragon who'd already adopted this practice of the Rambam. And they go back to the fact that who were the Spanish Portuguese in London in the 1700s and 1800s, not particularly learned people. And the decisions were taken informed by what was done in places like Aragon and what was decided by authorities like the Rambam, who of course is significant to them. So they taken together, that's why they do what they do, why they don't do what they don't do.
Can I make a
Interestingly, I'm aware
joke,
of time.
Rabbi? Can I
what?
make a joke? A joke
What now?
on this? It's about this.
So
It's
just
true.
1 second, Alan. Let me just finish for a
Okay,
second.
I'm
and then-
waiting. I'm
Okay.
waiting. Yeah.
Okay. So I want to now just segue to the last source. And the last source is from Rav Ovadia Yosef, who, by the way, visited that community on a number of occasions, and of course was a chief rabbi of Israel, author of a tremendous number of responses. Yabia Omer and Yechavedat. Actually have the volume of Yechavedat here. And what does Rav Ovadia Yosef say about this question? Because he is asked, if you see source 9, he says in some communities here in Israel, where Olim have come from North Africa, now Gimata, the practice is in Musaf, they don't do the repetition, like is now already been the practice in London and Amsterdam for centuries, okay? So he says, what should we say about that? So obviously in Israel, it's an interesting thing when people come with different minhagim, and the question is, what should be done in validating them or saying, it's not what we do here. And Rav Ovadia Yosef, obviously familiar with all the Teshuvot, he's familiar with everything, right? He's familiar with all the Teshuvot of the Rambam, Rav Ben Rambam, and the Rivash, and the Radbaz, etc., etc. He knows the Keter Shem Tov as well. And he goes on to say, of course, that talking in shul is wrong, and of Yosef Karo, for whom he felt he was the ultimate ambassador, he was like the Maran of Maran, right? He castigated those who spoke during prayer. He even quotes mystical writings, and he sometimes doesn't, saying how wrong it is to pray, to talk during prayer. And then he goes to the thesis of the Radbaz. Remember, the Radbaz says, you who are more educated, most certainly it's not appropriate for you to skip the repetition of the Amidah. The only excuse was people who are totally uneducated and disrespectful. But now that people are more educated, surely it's on them to be more respectful and value what is the repetition of the Amidah. And so he goes on to kind of say, people do what they do. I don't think Rav Ovadia felt he could be the policeman of every community, although I think there were times when he hoped he could be.
He almost was.
He hoped he could be, right. But still, when it comes down to it, he said, nowadays, and really the main argument is, we don't want to have divisions in how we practice prayers. We don't want to have agudot. And nowadays, there's never been more Torah studied in the world, in history, than it is in Eretz Israel. So in a country where Jews live, where we have many, many more learned Jews, where people are much more literate, right? And where we don't want to create fractures, it would be crazy to endorse or even ideally let continue practices of communities which are rooted in different cultures and a lack of prayer literacy, and a lack of respect for prayer. Again, could he go to every community? No, but when somebody asks him a shaila and he paskins, obviously this has impact on what people say, how people act, and what is done. And ultimately what he rules is, this shouldn't be done. This shouldn't be done anymore. Long gone are the times, or long gone should be the times where shul feels a need, they can't do chazat hashatz, certainly here in the land of Israel.
May I say something, Rabbi?
Yes, and then we've got a couple more people, and we got to finish in
Okay.
about 2 minutes.
Yeah, well, I want to say is that the Ashkenazi man who does not express himself so openly at home because of the Ashkenazi woman, I am one of them, expresses himself freely with his friends, colleagues in shul, and speaking is a sign of non-slavery. So he feels a free man in shul. The Sephardi man, who is domineering at home much more so, can shut up in shul because he's talked so much at home. There is
as somebody who is Sephardi,
it's
who
a
grew up
joke.
Ashkenazi, I
It's
don't
a
know
joke only
which
if you're
part to
83
necessarily.
can you laugh at that.
Let's leave that for later conversation. I'd question some of those conclusions, but certainly food for thought. Those who are here, sorry.
It just, maybe it's obvious, but I just want to point out the actual irony of what Holman and Atlas just said. Started out for those who are not literate to do the Hazarat Hashem, and the whole piece he brings to the end is that we're so literate now, there's so much more we
Yeah.
could, we shouldn't have a cancel it.
Correct.
So it's like,
It's ironic because ultimately, what I mentioned right at the beginning, there are two things happening. What are we discussing? Changes in the prayer service and whether rabbinic decrees are timeless or not. This isn't really a question of whether you know how to daven or you don't. It's about protecting the whole establishment of halakha itself. Rabbi is going out to bat for more than just chazat hashatz.
I once went to a shul in Israel, and they did the whole, they didn't do a Hazarat Hashatz, but the silent Amida, they sang the whole thing together.
That's funny.
Right, was it Sfaradi?
Yeah, they did it. And
Oh.
they would have coffee.
Oh, obviously, that's
And they should not.
move on made up. Right. So
They sang it beginning to end. the silent
right, and that the whole issue of chanting, which is sorry, so to repeat, there's been a visit to a shul where the silent Amidah is seemingly chanted out loud. Certainly, chanting in a communal way is the way that Temanim pray, is significantly the way that parts of prayer are recited by other Sephardi communities, right? Well, that's a point. Every community has a different dynamic between the private prayer and the communal prayer, where Sephardim seem to put more on what we do together. Ashkenazim often emphasize more of what people pray privately. Here, obviously, there is a tension. And this is one of these interesting questions where what wins, the person or the individual or the collective, right? The private prayer, well, I know how to pray, or the collective prayer that we do public prayer, communal prayer for those who don't. What we see in this Teshuvah Ravaja, and it's correct, there is something ironic about the conclusion. Something was instituted for those who don't know. In a time when people know, we double down on it. But it's important to know what's a subtext of that Teshuvah. It's not just Chazat Hashatz. It's rabbinic authority. It's unity of prayer services. It's a fear of change. Right? It's a recognition that we need to revere prayer itself. And so I find this whole discussion not just relevant to Chazat Hashatz, but an interesting window into, is change available in a prayer service? When people talk about changes, adding things, detracting things, there are many different things in many different contexts. I say, look through Chazat Hashatz as a case study, because there are strong arguments to say that maybe we don't need it today, and yet we've doubled down. And there are strong arguments to say that a community who disrespects it should be saying it, and yet they were allowed to do so. Halachic decision-making is often based on, we think it's putting people first, but in this case, it was actually about putting prayer first. Wherever you can, put prayer first. If prayer has been thrown under the bus, we have to salvage what we can and let go of the rest. But where that isn't the case, we need to hold tight to it, precisely because there are others who wish to do it harm, show it disdain. So case studies like these, I think, are revealing about what is a mindset of psika, of halachic decision-making, how we evaluate different situations, what is the difference between a temporary decision for a particular community, and how do we use precedent? Remember the Rabbi's case. I saw them doing it, I want to do that, but you're different. Always know that. And yet, how some communities perhaps may well be proud that they don't do chazarah. But what does that actually tell us? It means that at least at some point or another, their community wasn't listening when they should have been paying attention. So with that, we're going to end. Good to see you all. We're going to stop this.
Can I ask one question?
Great. I'm going to stop the recording. Should I stop the recording, Melissa? I think so. Oh, I won't for that matter. Okay, yeah.
I guess my question is, because it wasn't what the shiur dealt with, but then if you're davening to yourself anyway, then where does the minyan come together? I guess in Kaddish and other things? Because I always thought of Chazarat Hashatz, and this is up a whole other shiur. The Chazarat Hashatz is what ties everyone together in the tefillah when you're davening your Amidah, and then it ties you all together in the minyan.
You know, I give a course on the thought of Rav Soloveitchik, and one of the themes he always goes back to is the relationship between the individual and the collective. You know, Heschel says, we pray together, and each one of us by ourselves. That's a question which we should all be asking, which is answered differently by basically every person. Because is it the fact that we're in the same building? Oh, okay, but we're often praying on our own. Maybe it's a place that binds us together. Or maybe it's the prayers, but then what if we don't have a minyan of people praying together? Does that count as communal prayer? So those things need to be teased out. I do think Chazarat Hashatz does, but ultimately what we see from this is it only does when we choose it to. It only does when we make an investment to be part of that prayer community and say we're all saying amen together. And that itself is something which clearly in some communities didn't occur. Okay, for those who wrote things in the chat, I didn't yet see them until now, so apologies. Okay, great, fantastic. And obviously, like before, my email address is at the top of the handout, so if you have any further questions, feel free to be in